All right, I came close to forgetting, but I did just hit the record button, so that is
Oh, good
good.
deal.
um, hey, why don't I thank you all for being here today? Why don't I go ahead and start us out? We have what we think is probably a pretty full agenda today, and Angie and I are going to kind of tag team on talking us through some of our different topics for today. But if you will remember, there were last time we met, we had some follow up or some leftover topics that we wanted to kind of jump in and spend a little bit of time on them today. I guess what we think is our bigger topic is behavior discipline and this idea of manifestation determinations. We're going to spend some time on that this afternoon, talking about that whole process when significant behaviors, challenging behaviors come into play for our students. But let's start with these kind of follow-up topics. And for a couple of them, transportation and extended school year, those are a couple of your kind of checkbox brief items that you indicate on the IEP on page G. But I think most of us know that we can get into some really deep, complex discussions with IEP teams and families about when do students need transportation, when are they eligible for extended year, and so we wanted to spend a little bit of time on those. And what you see on screen here, the PowerPoint, you probably noticed the link to this is on the course page for you to reference back whenever you might need it. But there are links here to two of these guidance pieces that we had kind of left with you last time, and encouraged you to maybe dig into those a little bit and maybe come with some questions. But we thought we would start out by kind of doing a kind of a summary, some key points for these areas, and then maybe give people a chance to throw in their own questions. So Angie, I think you were going to kind of talk us through extended year. Shall I stop sharing and turn it back to you and do it that way, or what's the
No,
best?
you can keep sharing. That's fine.
Okay.
It's going to be a pretty brief discussion. Hopefully, you all are familiar with the extended school year procedures and the procedures manual. One of there are just some key things we wanted to make sure we pointed out to you, because we're into February now, and so teams are going to start making these discussions making these decisions. They need to be making these decisions early enough so you can thoughtfully plan for what that will look like. But as you also see in the red there, right above the red, the parents have a right to appeal a decision that's made about extended school year services. So they need to have time to appeal that decision before we would actually come to the summer months. So it is recommended in procedures manual that you start having those conversations at least 60 calendar days before the end of the school year. And in some cases before other breaks where extended school year is a consideration. It's very rare, I think, that a child would need something, for example, over Christmas break or over a spring break time period. So generally, I don't hear of that happening very often, if at all, but definitely over the summer months. And you all are aware that this is not offered to every child. It's more of an exception rather than a rule. There are very few children that actually would qualify for extended school year services. But there's an extra form that has to be completed, and to make sure you're making the appropriate decisions by having multiple data sources to help make those decisions. If you'll go ahead and move to the next slide, please.
But
So there are 4 considerations for extended school year, and we're not going to go into those in any detail today. But the first thing is you're looking at the goal area of concern. And so what is it? What is that area of concern that the child really needs to have service for, so skills can be acquired or maintained without interruption? And as it says in parentheses, and if you have questions about this, Ron and I can tackle it, but it doesn't necessarily establish or preclude the need for extended school years if a goal area of concern, or if a goal is an area of concern, you should consider the remaining three factors. So definitely that's kind of your first go-to, is reading an area of concern, and what is it that needs to be acquired or maintained without interruption, and then look at the other characteristics. Regression, has there been or is there the potential for significant regression, and what does your data tell you about other times where the child has not had those services? So how long does it take to maintain a skill or recoup that skill given periods of time where the student hasn't had instruction? Go ahead. Rare and unusual circumstances, that critical state of skill development, and oftentimes we think of that for younger children. They're just starting, they're just about ready to gain a skill. It could be walking, talking, learning about something that's very relevant and important for them, and the other rare and unusual circumstances. So in the procedures manual, that kind of indented bullet, situations where failure to provide a service will likely result in permanently losing or severely limiting the capacity or potential to acquire skills. So younger kid, maybe some students with autism, those kinds of things. So again, we don't have a lot of children that qualify for extended school years, but this is one of those things that it's an IEP team decision based on multiple sources of data, and you're really looking at that critical state of skill development. And then other factors to consider. I actually went online and I almost linked it in here, but I did find a nice resource from a different state. You see in that second bullet, other considerations, degree of impairment, student's rate of progress, regression, recovery time from regression, and so forth. And they had kind of a form or a walkthrough that would be different than what we have for extended year services, where people could kind of map out some different things, the progress, regression that they've seen, and so forth. So if if you're out there Googling, some evening because you don't have anything better to do, you might come up with something that you think is just really cool to be able to use to help make those decisions. As it stated earlier, you really need to, this is a checkbox on Form G, and so it should be discussed at every IEP meeting. Very rarely in September will you know that you need to have extended school year services in the spring. But it needs to be addressed. It's more than just saying, oh, he doesn't qualify for extended school year. So my question to throw out to you all is, when you come to Form G and you come to this question, what conversation do you have in September, October? So I'm asking that to the group, if anybody would be willing to share what they might say, how they might talk about this question with a parent in the context of an IEP meeting. So who might be able to share kind of what their process usually is? Or if you've thought about doing something different, what might that look like?
It would certainly be appropriate to look at the fall benchmarks compared to like spring benchmarks, look and see if how much ground has been lost. I'm high school resource, level 1 student, so it's not something that we would have a yes to very often, but that's, would be a way I would start the conversation is looking at those benchmarks.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So you're having a IEP meeting in October, and you can talk about, how you might qualify for extended school year. If it's not available to everyone, you have to qualify, maybe what that looks like, and then you could start having that conversation about data. One of the things we look at is their spring benchmark data and then their fall benchmark data, and we look at how much ground they've lost, if at all, and then how much time it takes for them to kind of catch up to where we would want them to be. or to catch up to where they were in the spring. And, certainly kind of describing that in that capacity would be one way you could talk about it at a meeting. That's great. It is more difficult at the high school level because you don't have some of those standardized, if you will, assessment periods like you do at elementary. But you do have your progress monitoring data. And, in October, you would be able to see how they performed and done over Christmas break, possibly spring break, and over the summer, you'll have new data to show where they're at and then how well they're catching up. All those data pieces are important to consider. If you on your meeting notice, and I think that might be in one of the next slides on your meeting notice, because you're talking about extended school year at each IEP meeting, your meeting notice doesn't have to say anything different. But if you're having a special meeting to really talk about extended school year, that should be a part of your meeting notice to talk about the purpose of the meeting. When you do it, and these are just things out of the procedures manual and part of the form, what does that look like? It could be an existing program that your school already has if it meets the student's needs. It could be a community program. We had a kiddo that went to a program in Des Moines for several sessions over the summer, and that was his extended school year because it focused on his area of need. That monitoring and supervision is required, and that's the responsibility of qualified SPED personnel. So that has to also be addressed in terms of what's that monitoring going to look like during that time. It's going to be a little bit different than what their goal is, so you may need to figure out how we're going to monitor progress during that time frame. Ron, I think you can go on to the next one. All right, so any other questions about extended school year? You're going to really start to consider that 60 days prior to the end of the school year. For those that you've got a question about, you're going to have that meeting. Use multiple sources of data. Make sure parents have an opportunity to review and understand that. And if they have questions, call another meeting because, they do have that right to due process if they don't agree. We hope they don't use that. We hope they come back and communicate with us. All right.
All right, transportation. We wanted to talk a little bit about the idea of special transportation as an IDEA IEP service. And you hopefully, or if you haven't, you can use this as a resource in the future. That link that we provided on the site was kind of a Q&A document for special transportation that the Iowa DE put out several years back. It's very useful, but it's very detailed. It is a 12-page Q&A document. So all kinds of scenarios are in there that kind of would guide you towards when are we required to provide transportation, when are we not? Because actually the issue of transportation has, just across the country, it has resulted in a lot of litigation, a lot of disagreements, and it just seems to come up from time to time. So we thought it would be just good to talk a little bit about that in more detail today. This idea of transportation services. I have a few kind of big idea type things that I just wanted to kind of share with you, that highlight, and then I'd be curious if anybody has any situations or specific questions about transportation. But just starting off here, the first note you see here on the screen, not every child with a disability is entitled to special transportation. So it's a yes/no question on the IEP. So the guiding principle is specialized transportation needed? Is it necessary for a child to receive FAPE? So if the transportation, let's say, might be requested by a family, if the reasons for that transportation don't relate to a child's disability, it is not a requirement to provide that. And, even just glancing at this Q&A document here, Um, here's an example. Imagine if a child lives too close to school for transportation as a matter of right. Her mother requests special transportation because the mother's vehicle is frequently in a repair shop. This special transportation request has nothing to do with the child's disability. Matters of living situation or parent convenience, such as work schedule, lack of reliable transportation, custody and visitation issues, foster care placement, etc., are not disability-related reasons that would entitle a child to transportation as a related service. So that's just one of many examples, but just that big idea that when an IEP team is answering that question about transportation, if the answer is yes, it is supposed to be because of the unique parts of that child's disability that they need transportation. So, the more obvious reasons, or demonstrations of need would be things like, a child in a wheelchair, where you need a lift in order to get that child to school, things like that. But there's lots of other times when it's maybe less clear. You could think of issues of a student with an intellectual disability that might have difficulty with navigating, interpreting road signs, things like that, safety issues. But the conversation should be about whether there's a need because of the child's disability. Second note on there, these are individual decisions. You want to really be careful to not make assumptions or not make blanket decisions. For example, that all kids in a particular classroom or have a particular label, they're either entitled or they're not entitled. It should be an individual decision. It shouldn't be, if the child has an intellectual disability, yes, they're entitled, or all preschoolers are entitled. We shouldn't think of it that way. It should be individually decided. Extracurriculars. I thought that was worthy of a bullet point here. You may have had that question come up with some of your students, maybe especially if you work with secondary age kids. The bottom line answer to that question, do we have to provide transportation for extracurricular activities? Yes, if that activity is required on the IEP, for sure. Or also, if transportation is needed for a child to have equal opportunity for participation, then we need to provide it. So that those two things translate into most of the time, yes. Most of the time, yes. If a student needed specialized transportation in order to participate in extracurriculars, that would be a district obligation. Before I jump to this next one, I have a couple more points, but just on some of the things you see on screen right now, anybody have any thoughts or questions that kind of relate to some of these?
Ron, I know I had a kiddo that was the football manager, and he was in a wheelchair and had to be transported to all of the football games away. And so the school had a special lift bus for him. And generally there were a few other kids that were willing to ride on that bus with him to keep him company. But the school made that accommodation because he needed that type of service to be able to participate as the football manager.
Yeah, good example, yeah. Oh, here's a good lead-in one for our discussion on discipline today. What about suspension and transportation? In this Q&A doc, there's actually several kind of detail Q&A kinds of situations. What happens if this? What if the kid's kicked off the bus? I wanted to kind of give you kind of a general principle here, and there's more detailed examples. But if a student is removed from transportation for violating a bus rule, so if they're kicked off the bus, let's say for a behavior, And if transportation is listed as a related service on the IEP, then that removal from the bus would count as a day of suspension, unless the school makes alternate provisions to get that child to school. And the interesting thing about this is I put this in italics based on some case law. That's true even if the child makes it to school anyway. So in other words, if the IEP says that that child needs special transportation and they're removed from the bus because of violating a rule, the district is obligated to make provision to get them there somehow. Otherwise, that's viewed as a suspension.
Can I interject on that?
You bet.
We have had a few students in the past who have had behaviors on the bus, been kicked off consequently for 3 days to one time there was a student who was kicked off for 3 weeks. But we contacted the parents and they were willing to drive that student to school, and then our district reimbursed them for their mileage. And they were willing to do that if they would receive the reimbursement. So then we're talking then that's the alternate provision that's referred to there? Is that what we're saying?
Great example.
Okay.
And I say yes. Yeah, I think, so
Okay.
even though there's a little caveat, if you don't make alternate provisions and they show up anyway, if mom drives them anyway, it would still be counted as suspension. That was based on some case law that's come up before. But yeah, no.
Okay, so you're saying the key ingredient is that the district makes the alternate provision.
Yes.
And at that point, okay.
Yes, and I would say compensating the parent for doing it would to me would be absolutely
qualify.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep. So they're ensuring that the child has access to FAPE by doing that. Yep. Great question though. And I know that does come up. I know that's happened in a number of districts I've worked with at different times. How about preschoolers? This is a interesting one to think about. I know even a number of years ago, with our special education coordinators group, the transportation, was a topic on the agenda, and I think there was some confusion even across the state about, are all preschoolers eligible for special transportation? Well, the answer is no. And the Q&A that you have on the course page, it mentions that just by virtue of being young is not an entitlement for transportation. And the reason that at first we might be thinking, oh my gosh, are we gonna send these kids on the road to fend for themselves walking in the big city or whatever? But the idea is preschoolers without disabilities are also young, and they're not entitled to transportation on that basis. So, even for our young ones, now some districts choose to say, you know what, we have a special education preschool. We're gonna bring all the students here. That's absolutely fine. But as far as the requirement to do that, the requirement is there a disability related reason in order to do it? All right. How about any other transportation thoughts or questions? It can get muddy and can get controversial occasionally.
We've had students who initially don't have special transportation, but they do have behavior goals. And there's been like a time when they got removed from the bus and couldn't ride the bus. So then what we do is go back, amend the IEP at that point for special services while they're off the regular route bus. So it's just during those points that we check for special transportation. And then when, they're back on the regular route, then it's not needed anymore?
So, okay. So, I'm not sure if I totally understand. So,
So when, like, during their IEP, just before, let's say, the incident happened on the bus, they have behavior goals, but they haven't required
mhm,
special transportation.
okay.
But then when an incident occurred to the magnitude where they did get removed from the bus for a set period of time, then we have gone in and amended the IEP at that point, saying because they do have a behavior goal, they do need this special transportation for a period of time. Is that okay?
You know, an amended IEP is an IEP, and that's an IEP team decision. So if that need is determined, absolutely. I guess I would say it probably wouldn't be, I guess I wouldn't do that on an incident by incident basis, but it sounds like this student or, someone you're thinking of, it was, things got worse and their disability was requiring that. And so if that's amended, then I think that can be fine. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Good question. All right. Well, why don't we keep moving forward?
All right, so this one is just kind of I don't know how best to say it, but it's an important consideration. We have told the special ed coordinators for years that the prior written notice is one of the most important documents or pages of the IEP, because it's really a summary of the decisions that were made at the meeting and the recommendations that were made. And it's one of the first documents that a parent attorney would pick up and look at and say, what do we know is going on with this kiddo? So one of the first things that we know can happen is, I think there's a little box that you can check, and everything, all the services from Form F can just fly over really nicely to the prior written notice. It's transported. We discourage that. That information is already summarized on the Form F. We want to know what are those relevant decisions and recommendations that were made. So the team decided that, X, Y, and Z. The team decided that he would have a transition plan for X, Y, Z. The team decided that we're going to change his behavioral services from, this to that. So summarize all those relevant decisions and recommendations rather than having all of that information fly from Form F to Form Z, because it muddies the document and it's confusing, and we're just recommending that you just take that out and just have a real concise summary again of those decisions and recommendations. Just helps for clarity of what actually happened at that meeting. I don't know, Ron, did you have anything else that you wanted to say about the prior written notice?
I don't think so, but yeah, that idea of what was, I think, intended in the Web IEP world to be a helpful thing originally. Hey, let's have this information on page F just fly over there. I agree. It sometimes just makes the prior written notice look like blah blah blah, whereas a more concise, here's the decisions that were made, here's what we're going to do, is probably a lot more helpful. Absolutely.
With a recent experience, and I'll just share that really briefly so we can move on, but a recent experience we had an annual IEP meeting over 3 different sessions. So it was a 2-hour meeting, a 2-hour meeting, and about a 3.5-hour meeting. Way too long, yes, but that's the way it went. And so what we did, instead of creating 3 separate prior written notices, we just, any decision we made, we put the date of that decision. So first meeting, was November 1st. These are the decisions that we made at that meeting. At the next meeting, December 1st. These are the decisions we made at this meeting. And you also have to know your parent. In this particular case, we had a meeting on a Thursday, and on Monday, the school started making some changes. Parent had not received a hard copy of the draft prior written notice, and she was very upset that the school district had already started making these changes without her actually seeing a copy of everything that was decided, so she could just view it all at once. So be real careful of your parent audience as well. Make sure you know them to know, if you start implementing something, you've made that decision. Generally speaking, you can have that conversation about when I'm going to start implementing, but parents also need a chance to kind of consider, is this okay? Ron, I don't know if there's still that kind of either written or unwritten rule of kind of 10 days. You'll write this up, and if you don't hear anything from the parent within a certain period of time, you're okay to implement. Can't recall if that's still in the procedures or not, but make it real clear at the end of the meeting what you're going to do and when you're going to start those changes. And if you have a parent that can be contentious, just make it real clear what you're going to be doing.
Yeah, I think I agree. Clarity is the key. Is everybody walking out of the room? If it's going to start tomorrow, did they hear that? If it's going to start in 5 days, did they hear that? So
right. Yeah. Okay. The last one that I had before we move on to discipline is about the meeting notice. There are so many times where I go in and I can actually see when a meeting notice was created. And if it was created after the IEP meeting, that's a problem. Parents need to be given adequate notice and proper notice of the content of the meeting. And so you can text a parent, you can call a parent, you can do all kinds of things as long as you include all of the relevant information, but they should be getting an additional electronic copy or hard copy to have in front of them for that kind of documentation that you've done that. And your team members that are invited need to have a copy of that too, so they're understanding the purpose, they know who's going to be there, and it needs to be in a timely manner. Generally speaking, calling them one day and saying, oh, well, let's have it tomorrow, because you may not be able to get the required team members there. So it's really about communication with everybody, providing notice to all team members, including the parent, and making sure the meeting notice includes all of those required things, and they're listed there. But a legally defensible practice or legally indefensible practice is to be creating those a day before or even after the IEP meeting. So just be aware of that. The meeting notice is, the procedures are there for a reason, and it's a protection for the child, it's a protection for you, and it's a protection for the process.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So,
we can't hear you very well.
now can you hear me?
Yes.
It's about as loud as I can get.
That's good.
So with all the recent weather and we've had to have all kinds of rescheduling that has happened the day before. And so is it enough to document on the prior written notice, why a new meeting notice was created 12 hours before the second meeting was held?
Yeah, I think any reasonable person would understand that as long as it's documented somewhere. We, like in the situation where we had three meetings for the same annual, we did create a new meeting notice for each of those. We had plenty of time to do that. But either in the prior written notice or on the Form I think it's appropriate to say this was rescheduled. This was a mutually agreed upon time. All team members have been noticed. The purpose of your meeting has not changed, but it was a mutually agreed upon time, and everybody's been informed. So just, yeah, be clear on either the prior written notice form or on the other information page. Just, you just want to be open, honest, and transparent with these things, and that's the best way to do that.
And thank
Yeah, good question. Thank you. All right, we're going to move right into discipline. And discipline is difficult. Most of us don't deal with situations very often. I get a phone call maybe once every other month from one of my staff members or from a school, and I have to go back to the procedures manual and look through it, and still sometimes I feel like I don't fully understand what the process is. So it's a struggle. It can be complex and challenging, not only for you guys, but for your administrators, for our staff, and even for people like Ron and I, because that's not the life we live on a day-to-day basis. But that when you're disciplining a student with a disability, there are some protections, some legal protections for that student. And so what you do for that student might look different than for a student without an IEP. And in some cases, there are special circumstances that apply. And I think I've listed that later on. So Ron, you want to go ahead and move it forward? So there are 3 types of removals that are listed in IDEA and in our procedures, and those are expulsion, in-school suspension, and out-of-school suspension. And, I'm not going to go, did someone have a question? I won't go through those in any detail, but just know expulsion is done by school board, and the student must have continuing services. And that would allow them to not only access IEP support, but allow them to continue within the general education curriculum. So if you're going the expulsion route, there are some protections that student has to continue to make progress. In-school suspension is removal from class or activities for disciplinary reasons, but they remain in school. And I think we talk about this in just a few minutes, but in general, it should be, they should be in a similar setting that non-special ed students would be in. Even if there's no other special ed students in there, they have the opportunity to interact with students without disabilities. And I think that's a little bit later on. And then your out of school suspension, which that's a removal to the home or other center. And if the removal is for more than 10 days, school board action is required. And that one just kind of threw me off, and I didn't go back to that in my review. So Ron and I might have to talk a little bit more about that with you. Go ahead. So when you're talking about removals, so whether it's in-school suspension and out-of-school suspension or whatever, you have to answer several questions. And the first one would be, will the student be able to appropriately participate in the gen ed curriculum? Okay, so we want to ask that question first. Would they be able to receive the services specified in their IEP? And will the student be able to participate with students without disabilities to the extent provided in the child's current placement? So, and that last one is what I was just talking about. In-school suspension meets the requirements of able to participate with students with disabilities if that in-school suspension is created for all students, even if there are no students with disabilities in there. So what does all that mean? Gonna move on, Ron?
Sorry.
Okay, so when you're looking at removals, we are looking at a couple of things. For more than 10 consecutive school days, or more than 10 school days in a school year for separate incidents of behavior that constitute a pattern. And that pattern language always throws me off. What does that mean? So we've got pretty clear, I'm going to suspend you for 10 consecutive school days. That's a change in placement. That's a removal. But this 10 school days for separate incidents. So the pattern means a series of removals for more than 10 school days in a year, The behavior that caused the removal is substantially similar to the behavior that caused previous removals. So that would be things like fighting. So they were suspended for fighting here, they were suspended for fighting here, they were suspended for fighting here. So those behaviors are substantially similar to he was fighting here and physically fighting with a student, and he was belligerent to a teacher. Those would not be as similar, substantially similar. And then considering additional factors such as length, time, and proximity of this series of removals. So the important rule is, in all of this, is the 11-day rule, the 11th day rule. On the 11th day, the student must receive FAPE. So you kind of have, some people throw around that idea of you got 10 free days, but on the 11th day, the student must receive FAPE. And that means access to IEP services and access to progress within the general ed curriculum. And those are all, especially that gen ed curriculum access is kind of difficult for people to wrap their head around, me including. But that would be an individual IEP team decision to determine what's important, what's most important for that child to learn academically related to the core, and what are those key things they need to learn or have access to with their IEP. Go ahead. So a short-term removal will be less than 10 days. You don't have to provide any kind of educational service. It's not considered a change in placement. You don't have to do a manifestation of termination, which Ron will talk about. And you don't have to do an FBA or a BIP. They're not required in general. So that would be a short-term removal. On the other hand, on the next slide, we have long-term removals, which is more than 10 days. So again, they must receive services to progress in the general ed curriculum and advance towards the IEP goals. And the IEP team must meet to talk about those things. What's that going to look like? We've already kind of talked about this, so I don't think I'm going to go through this. Although if you look at about the 5th or 6th bullet, the parents can challenge the determination, the manifestation of termination through a due process. So you need to know that. And the last bullet, if it's not a pattern or not a change in placement, the school officials can determine what services are needed to allow participation in gen ed curriculum and progress towards IEP meeting after consulting with at least one teacher, which that was kind of new to me as well. I hadn't really paid attention to that. Go ahead. Additionally, if it's more than 10 consecutive days, you must do a manifestation of termination. If it's more than 10 cumulative days that constitute a pattern, you have to do a manifestation of termination. If it's more than 10 cumulative days with no pattern, so it's not substantially similar in terms of the behavior, you can use the same disciplinary procedures for all students, but the IEP services as outlined by the school must be provided. And if it's 10 days cumulative or less, you can use the same, or less than 10 cumulative days, the same disciplinary procedures can apply. So this is a nice document, this PowerPoint, to just kind of maybe have on hand when you're thinking about, kiddos that are getting close to that 10-day rule, to just have at a glance. The other thing that's available in your procedures manual is that suspension and expulsion flow chart. And if you click on that, this kind of helps you walk through what do you do. We have several scenarios we're going to have you look at, and we're doing mine first, Ron, and then yours, right?
Yes, that'd be great. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I will tell you up front, I put 4 scenarios in here, and we're going to break into breakout rooms and have you consider what you would do based on this chart with each of the scenarios. I did not include, and I should have, a scenario where special circumstances apply. Okay, so special circumstances. If you have a kid that brings a weapon to school, an IEP student who brings a weapon to school, or has one on school property, you're automatically going to go to the items in the box. You're going to do a manifestation determination. You're going to, you're going to move through that process. The other special circumstance is drugs. You're going to scroll back up a little bit, Ron, to the top. So if they bring drugs to school or on school property, you're automatically, that's a special circumstance, you're automatically shifted to that box. And serious bodily injury, and one of the examples has a broken nose in it, that's not a serious bodily injury. When you speak with attorneys, they talk about, hospitalization and severe mutilation or severe injury. It's not probably even a broken wrist or a broken nose. It's something that requires a lot of medical attention. There's no real black and white definition of what that means, but it's more than just, a fight where you break a nose or cause some bleeding or cause some cuts. So I did not include any scenarios that would automatically take you to that special circumstance where you have to do the manifestation, you have to provide faith as you're going through a process of determining what you're going to do with this kiddo discipline-wise. So we are going to break you into breakout rooms, and there's 16 of you, so I think we could probably do 4 rooms. You'll automatically be assigned to those rooms, and what I would do is have one of you, at least one of you, pull up the PowerPoint and look at each of the scenarios. We're going to give you about probably close to 10 minutes, so it'll be pretty quick, 10 to 11 minutes to get through as many scenarios as you can and decide what you would do based on this step-by-step guide. So at least one of you can pull up the guide, and at least one of you can pull up the scenario and read that and kind of walk through what would we do. Any questions about that? All right, Ron will break us into rooms, and then he will click a button at some point, and that will give you a 1-minute warning. So Ron, I would suggest you click that button at about 4, maybe 29.
Okay. And we said how many rooms are we looking? We have 15 participants currently.
I would say 3 or 4.
Okay, here we go.
Make sure you join your breakout room. You have a box that popped up on your screen.
LaDonna, are you getting a, doesn't look like you're in a room. You should have had a prompt pop up on your screen. Did that happen? And you are muted, so I can't hear you right now. LaDonna, can you hear me? Am I coming through? If you can hear me, you have your microphone muted, so I can't hear you unless you open up your mic. And you should have gotten a pop-up that would let you click on that to go into a breakout room.
Okay, I'm here. I'm back.
Hi, did you
Hi.
you,
Now I've got it. I had to leave for a moment, so I'm
I-
back.
do you have a pop-up where you can click on that and jump into your breakout room? Perfect.
That's ridiculous.
Oh, that was 5-minute warning. Well, don't they get the
Hi,
message?
I jumped in. Angie, I got a note that said Angie Radloff has asked for help.
Yeah, we cannot find any scenarios that we're supposed to be going through.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. The PowerPoint on the course page.
Yeah.
Um,
We got the chart.
so if you get scenario, you're not seeing scenario 1, scenario 2, scenario 3.
No.
You're in the PowerPoint.
Yeah. Let's see.
I
Oh,
found
good.
a scenario, but which one are we doing?
The goal was to as many as you can get to. Pick one and start, and it was just the idea was just to get you into smaller groups so you maybe would have a little bit better discussion. So at least one, and if you can get to more than one, that's great. I know we're going to be caught on time here. So
All right.
all righty.
Okay.
So if you can see it, could you read it? Because I'm still not.
Yeah, here we go. So John is 15, has an IEP for a reading disability. He has never had any office referrals, is a B student, is on the track team, and is in band. Teachers would describe Got here fast.
All right, I think everybody's jumping back in here slowly.
Hey, that was slick. We probably did not get a chance to get through all 4 scenarios. I know my group did not. So we'll look at that first one real quick, and if someone's willing to kind of share out. So this was a pretty simple one, reading disability, you know, only a couple of days suspension, just real quick, because I want to have time for Ron. What would you say on this one?
Mother. The bloody nose.
Yeah, this one really was just, didn't really meet any of the discipline provisions. School can apply the same discipline procedures used for all students.
Yes.
That one was a pretty simple one.
Yep.
We got to the second one, and we ended up with probably the potential of consideration 3 being no. We didn't feel like the behavior was related to their disability of ADHD, and we didn't think the school failed to implement the IEP. So we went down that route, and then we started having the discussion about, well, what does services to progress in the general ed curriculum look like? And that's kind of where we got stuck. And really, you know, being an IEP team decision about what are the most important things that the student needs to know. Ron, did you have any other thoughts about what that looked like? We kind of talked about, you know, reading and math maybe were key to, you know, for progression, but maybe there wasn't going to be much of a focus on social studies and science, for example, during that suspension. And we didn't get to scenario 3 or 4, so I don't know if anybody else did. You can always take a look at those later. Did you say you did?
We started on 3. We just thought we were supposed to do 3.
Oh, okay. That's fine.
So when we were looking at it, there's, I believe we said 9 days already that he was suspended, and he's getting ready for a 10-day, or the school is proposing a 10-day suspension. So we went through the manifestation flow chart. And basically going through it, we decided that the school could suspend.
Did you find it was a manifestation of his disability?
I believe we said no.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So did anybody get to scenario 4? Okay. Well, I think the thing that I would just say in summary is when you have these challenging situations, call on your AEA folks to help you. Use this flow chart, and it will help you and your team figure out what you need to do.
Mm-hmm.
And then call people like Ron and I. David Van Horn is the special ed director. If you have questions beyond that, and if you feel like you're getting into a legal battle with the parent, definitely call the regional administrator, because we can sit on those manifestation and termination meetings and support you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we wanted to just talk a little bit about doing the manifestation determination meeting itself. And so the question is, you know, so if oh, I'm sorry, I jumped there. If you know, so if we're looking at, Angie talked about that 10-day rule, and any, a pattern of suspensions beyond 10 days would be considered a change in placement. And we know that before we would do a change in placement, we have to do a manifestation determination for a student with a disability. So this basic idea of, determining, was the offense that might be causing the suspension or expulsion, was that related to the disability? And so on screen right here, you can see there are these two big questions and I'm going to pull up the actual guide, the form that a team uses that they complete when they do a manifestation. We can kind of look at how that flows there, but here's these two big grand finale questions. Was the code of conduct violation caused by or have a direct relation and substantial relationship to the individual's disability? So was the behavior due to the disability? That big broad question. The second one is, was the code of conduct violation the direct result of the school's or area education agency's failure to implement the IEP? So in other words, what if a student wasn't receiving the appropriate behavior supports? What if their behavior intervention plan wasn't being followed? And that was the cause of the incident that led to suspension. So either of those being a yes, could be, would result in, saying yes, it's a manifestation of their disability. So this, I'm just taking a link here that's in the PowerPoint. This is actually, let's make that a little bit bigger. Maybe, well, let me make it a little bit bigger there, but this is actually the, this form kind of actually shows a process. First of all, the team would start by, what is the code of conduct violation? So clarifying what was the incident that led to this, the suspension that is approaching the 10-day timeline. So there's a place to document the incident, get dates in there for the team to review. And so then it goes on to IEP team review. The following information was considered. So that's a place to consider, information that the team's going to talk about, that student's current IEP program. And that kind of gives some background information on their disability. And you can see there's just a series of additional questions here before we get to that final decision. The process wants to know, has there been a history, previously documented or not, of behavioral concerns for the student? If yes, briefly describe. But notice if no, you can jump directly to the manifestation decision. So that would be, perhaps, what if a student's history of IEP has all been about reading, never had any behavior concerns, but they bring a machine gun to school, okay? That would be that kind of a student. And if it was no, never had any behavior problems before, you can jump right to the manifestation discussion. Second question there, does the history of behavior concerns include behavior similar to or related to the behavior that was a code of conduct violation? So getting in deeper into that discussion of, what patterns may we have seen or not seen with the student. Has a functional behavior assessment been completed for the student? If yes, what was the function or purpose of their behavior? So, if we have a student who has had a functional behavior assessment and a behavior intervention plan, and we know a little bit about the function of their behavior, what does that tell us about, maybe the reasons that this incident happened, this code of conduct violation? Then we have the behaviors of concern been considered in developing the IEP? So that's getting a little bit into, it's kind of asking the question, was the IEP written appropriately? Were the behaviors of concern taken into consideration in the current IEP? Then we have the behaviors of concern been addressed through interventions documented in the IEP. So it kind of, it's asking if you had this behavior intervention plan, has it been followed through with? What things have been happening? And it gets into questions related to that. So this, to me, this form really, it really leads the discussion. A manifestation team typically is going to walk through these questions, verbatim, have the conversations, and answer them, get some notes, and getting into the whole history of this student and their behaviors. And then we get to these two key questions that I showed you previously. Getting to the root issue of, was the behavior a manifestation of the disability? And so then there it is. If you have a yes to either one, it's a manifestation.
Mhm.
And this is just tagged onto the form itself, this little chart, and I want to kind of just quickly talk about this. What happens after a manifestation, and then I'm going to suggest maybe when we meet next time, we can do a quick review, and maybe we can look at a couple more scenarios and say, hey, let's think this through one more time. What would you do in this situation, before we move on to our next content? But look at this chart here. So on the left side, it's kind of squashed in there in my view here, but are there special circumstances, yes or no? And as Angie mentioned, that's the drugs, weapons, serious bodily injury. And then across the top, is it a manifestation? So if we look at that yes column, if it was a manifestation, the big idea there is disciplinary action constituting a change of placement may not be taken. Okay, so if the team says, yes, Johnny brought a machine gun to school and that was not because of his disability, you cannot suspend him beyond 10 days. So that, but then it goes on to have recommendations, consider doing functional behavior assessment if you've not, consider changing the IEP as needed, and so forth. And then for that yes, there's some different things. If we do have the special circumstances, that's the caveat that would allow this 45-day change in placement, and that's shown on the screen as well. So if it is a manifestation, then you cannot suspend further. If it's a no, if the behavior was not a manifestation, then you can take disciplinary action. Okay, so you could suspend or expel. But if you look at the description on that no column, the caveat is you still must continue to provide educational services. Okay, and so even if it was not a manifestation and the district would be allowed to suspend or expel, you have to continue to provide educational services. And the IEP team determines the setting of those services. So that gets very complex. Sometimes if we lived in a big city, there's probably a building somewhere in the school district that has a sign that says alternate educational center, and the kid goes there. they've been suspended or expelled, but they go there. In Southwest Iowa, it's just a real dilemma, for schools, because they know, well, we may be able to suspend them or even expel them, but we have to keep allowing them to receive FAPE and benefit from their IEP. And so sometimes that ends up still being maybe the student is going to an alternate placement, or a special setting or things like that. Occasionally, I know districts. I know of some districts that have tried to kind of cover that through some homebound. Maybe if the suspension is not extremely long, if it's a shorter term suspension, they can sometimes continue to offer services in that way. But if it was a no, they would be allowed to remove that student from school setting and provide services in a different way. So. Okay, sorry. I know that was a lot of information in an hour and 15 minutes, but we wanted to kind of cover those basics of behavior and discipline. And so I would, yeah, if we can plan on, maybe it'll give us a chance to do a little bit of a recap, or maybe you guys will have more questions too, but we can revisit a couple scenarios when we come back together next time and talk about how we might apply them to discipline issues. And we will plan on that. And yeah, so we have a little bit of a gap here before our next meeting time, March 27th, although that'll be here before we know it. And we have, actually, Angie, we had originally put transportation on there, but we kind of dealt with that on page G. But
Yeah.
We're going to look at some of those other kinds of situations, open enrollment, dual enrollment. I think we had considered talking about even homeschool situations for students with IEPs. So we'll delve a little bit into some of those special circumstance kind of things for students with IEPs.
Okay, I'll put I put
Ooh.
Iowa Connections Academy on there, just to have I support Iowa Connections Academy through my role, and some of the things we see on IEPs that are no-nos relative to that. So that might be interesting. The other thing that we might want to cover, Ron, is students that are not yet eligible for special education, but where the discipline provisions kind of protect them as well. So we might want to add that to the conversation.
That'd be great. Yeah, that'd be a good follow up on today's discussion. Great. So, okay, very good. And so, but I was going to say just one final thing. So these last two sessions in March and April, will give us a chance to tackle some of those other kind of things. And yeah, if you folks want to be thinking too, if you think of a topic that you think would be great for our group to discuss, send that our way, and we can, look at a way to kind of include that in our agendas. So,
Sounds great.
thanks everybody for being here. It's about that time, so I think we'll close and have a great evening.
Thank you, everybody.